Well, when it comes to women leaders doing extraordinary things, I think our next guest is an absolute superstar. She probably became a little more well known last year due to a little thing called COVID-19. She is the director of the Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity. Professor Sharon Lewin, it is an absolute joy to have you join us on Broad Radio.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Sharon, it's just over a year since the World Health Organization announced that we were in the middle of a pandemic, and the world is a very different place. We've all learned to go to school differently and learn differently and work differently and connect socially differently. What, from your perspective, because you've been in the thick of it with the work that you do around all the different things that the Doherty Institute does, what have you seen is the biggest shift in us as a society?
God, where do I begin? Well, of course, we're stuck in Australia and we can no longer travel. That's very, very significant, or leave our borders or visit loved ones away or come back home. So, the implications of that are enormous, especially for people that live in Australia whose families are abroad. It's changed, of course, the way we gather together, although Australia, has got a pretty normal life now. I mean, our day-to-day lives are pretty normal. There are still restrictions on numbers that can gather, but those restrictions are nowhere near as restrictive where countries are seeing. I think there's a high awareness around respiratory. We have, and now people really understand what that means to, stay at home when you're unwell, get tested. I think that will have implications for other infections. It's changed the way we work. It's changed the way we access and use online platforms, whether it's in banking or shopping or working. The world's a different place, incredibly different place.
Sharon, the Doherty Institute was the first in the world to grow the virus. What was that moment like? Was there a big celebration?
Well, yes, you're right. We were the first to grow the virus outside of China, I should add, and share it. So that was on January the 29th last year. And I hate to tell you, but I was actually in Chile at the time. So I wasn't in the building. I was in regular contact with Mike Catton, who was leading that effort. So I knew what was happening, but I was in Santiago, a million miles away from everywhere. I think we certainly knew that was a really big deal in January. I'm not sure the rest of Australia or the world were as focused on this as we were throughout January. And it was a big deal because it meant that people could suddenly work on tests, drugs and vaccines, because you need the virus to do that. It hadn't been shared until that moment. I was thrilled for the group that did it, Mike Catton and Julian Druce. I was thrilled for the message that it sends, that Australia can make a really big contribution, and that all this investment that we have had and need to continue in our scientists and virologists and this sort of deep expertise, pays off. You can't sort of pull that out of a hat once a new pandemic hits. So it was exciting, but I wasn't actually here. I was on the phone at the other end, on the other side of the world.
So at the moment, there's a lot of talk around the vaccination and the rollout. And my first question is vaccination the magic key to us getting back to what is as close to a normal life as possible?
Absolutely. How we're living currently in Australia is wonderful. I really do believe it. I think, we are in an extraordinary situation, but it cannot be like this forever. A, we're cut off from the rest of the world. B, we are in a precarious position. A vaccine, a virus can be brought in at any time, as we've seen on multiple occasions now. Quarantine, we do a good job of quarantine. There's been hundreds of thousands of people in quarantine, and we've had a handful of transmission events, but they happen. And so they can happen at any time, and especially in the winter time, we're at greater risk of it spreading through our population. So vaccination is absolutely key to getting back to normal, but vaccination won't be the magic bullet that suddenly means everything is back to normal. Life will still be different even once we're vaccinated.
In what way?
Well, in the initial phases, we still will need to be aware, especially in Australia, that vaccines reduce the chance of severe disease, but they don't eliminate the chance of infection. And by that I mean, virus in the nose that you may not be aware you have. And therefore, there still is a possibility of transmission. We're learning more and more about these vaccines. They definitely reduce both disease and infection, and almost certainly will reduce transmission. But in Australia, we've currently got a policy of no COVID. So we're not tolerant of anyone with COVID, symptomatic or not. And so that means in the early days, we will still need to quarantine on return from travel, for example. I think over time, though, as we get more and more people vaccinated, as we have a better understanding of the effects of vaccine on transmission, our policies will have to change. We will need to have a policy of no, severe COVID, not no COVID totally.
And where's our vaccination rollout at in Australia at the moment, Sharon?
Early days, we're just in our third week. As of yesterday, it was 160,000 Australians had been vaccinated, so tiny numbers. When we look around the world, even if you look at the vaccine programs that have done well, and that now includes the UK and the US, vaccine rollout does start slowly. It's a mix of supply, so access to the vaccine, as well as setting up the system. So we actually are going slower than we hoped, but I'm pretty confident it will speed up as we put all the systems in place, as we get more vaccine online, particularly from CSL manufacturing the AstraZeneca vaccine. At the moment, we're still in phase 1A, meaning that we're just vaccinating frontline healthcare workers, aged care residents and workers, disability residents and workers, and the border control, quarantine hotels and airport staff. And in Victoria, at least, about 80% of our frontline quarantine and border control have been vaccinated.
Do you find it frustrating that so much is sort of spoken about and speculated in the media and social media? And, now we're reading that AstraZeneca has been put on hold in Germany, Italy, France. And, there's so much conversation around it, but you are at the coalface of this and sort of the facts of it. Do you find it frustrating that sometimes there may be misinformation out there in the community because people then become very discontent around it all?
Yeah, on the one hand, I really like that there's such high interest and high awareness, and I think high literacy now around issues like a pandemic and a vaccine. So I think knowledge is good. I think the more knowledge people have is really, really good. Misinformation, of course, is bad because we don't want people to know the wrong things. Vaccine hesitancy is understandable. This is all new. People want as much information as they can. And I see that it's our responsibility, or people like me, to be able to convey that information as clearly and simply as we can. And real-time access to information is important, although it's complex. So if I could just briefly touch on the AstraZeneca issue, we have constant surveillance of potential associations of new unexpected adverse events with vaccines. But bad things happen all the time, meaning that people get blood clots, people get, can die from other unrelated issues. And the complexity here is sorting out from what's the background rates of, in this situation, blood clots, and is there an association with the vaccine? And also different regulatory agencies have different thresholds of risk. So the fact that some agencies are putting a pause on AstraZeneca and others tells me that the evidence is certainly not clear, and we are definitely hearing that the incidence of these blood clots is no higher than the background rates. These things take time to sort through. It doesn't mean that you close down the vaccine program every time a possible association is described. And it's routine. This happens all the time with vaccines, just that people aren't paying as much attention to it as they are here. And I personally have great faith in our systems in Australia. We have got an agency that is looking at all these same data that is being poured over across Europe. And our agency will make a decision on whether this is a real risk or not. And so far, they're not saying that this is a risk, meaning that we should pause the program. So I'm very confident in the process we have in place to look at these sorts of new information.
Sharon, it was interesting how the COVID outbreak brought back memories for some of the first few years of the HIV crisis in the 80s. And I've actually got there's a few questions in this. Where are we at, firstly, with HIV and AIDS now? And like, what treatments are available, and is it still a killer disease? And finally, we were really amazed to read that AIDS-related illnesses are the leading cause of death among 15 to 49-year-old females globally. We had no idea about that. So why are women and girls so disproportionately affected?
Yeah, quite a few questions in there. First of all, absolutely, those first few weeks or months of a new virus, limited information, some hysteria, some misinformation, was very reminiscent of the early days of HIV. I was a medical student actually in the early days of HIV, so I wasn't directly working, but it was very reminiscent, and not just HIV. Anytime a new infectious disease appears, such as Zika or Ebola or these other ones that we've seen, you have this element of hysteria while we're gathering the information. So, and I think for a lot of people living with HIV or who had lived through that era in the early 80s, certainly some friends and colleagues of mine, it did bring back some really bad memories of that time. Big difference was that in the early 80s, most people didn't care about HIV, and that was the tragedy of that period. While in COVID, you couldn't get a more concerned global community. Every single government is so concerned about this. And a lot of people living with HIV are appropriately angry about that, because in the early days, people weren't that interested in HIV. So where are we now with HIV globally? There are 37 million people living with HIV. There's 1.7 million new infections a year and 750,000 deaths. So people are still dying of HIV, and there are still a large number of new infections. But having said that, the outlook for people living with HIV is totally different now compared to the early 80s. We have outstanding antiviral treatment that's available to over 60% of the world. We want it to be high. We'd like it to be 90, 95%, but 60% of the world's population can access antiviral therapy. Antiviral therapy is cheap in low-income countries. It's simple. It's often just a single tablet a day. And just recently, just this year actually, the Australian government approved the use of injectable antivirals. So you can take a tablet a day, or now and in the future you could get an injection every 2 months, and it keeps your HIV under control, and people have a normal life expectancy. So unbelievable advances. Of course, we have 40% of people who are not accessing HIV. We have still people that die of HIV. And treatment is lifelong, which has problems, meaning that you've got to support economically access to treatment. It has side effects, and there's certainly still a stigma associated with HIV. And we don't have a vaccine. We've got new and very powerful ways to prevent HIV. Taking an antiviral tablet once a day or around the episode of a sexual contact can reduce your chance of getting HIV by about 99%, but we don't have a vaccine. So HIV has not gone away. It's a major problem in many communities, and it's a major problem in many parts of the world. And a lot more to do, particularly find a vaccine, find a cure, and make sure that everyone can access treatment. And finally, you asked about young women and AIDS. That's an incredible statistic, and it largely comes from sub-Saharan Africa, where in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, over 50% of young women are infected. I've done a lot of work in Durban, in South Africa, and Durban is an epicenter of HIV, and about 50% of the women in that age group that you described are infected. And if you're a young woman and you don't have access to education and you don't have access to a community talking about HIV, you may be scared to get tested. You might never get tested. You might be scared to take antiviral drugs. You might not even have the funding to take antiviral drugs. So a lot of this is related to women's disadvantage globally. And finally, just one statistic is globally there are more women infected with HIV than men.
It's really alarming, and something that you may wish to engage with. I'm sure that there are organisations, if you wish to do more or even assist in some way, maybe through donations or something, there are organisations out there, Sharon, that we can connect with?
Absolutely. Just even within Australia, we have the National Association of People Living with HIV, as well as the Australian Federation of AIDS organisations, and they represent women and men living with HIV or at risk of HIV. And then globally, there are many, many organisations, but one of the lead agencies that really advocates for better treatment and better care for women and access to education is UNAIDS, is a division of the United Nations. So that's a very good place to get more information.
Sharon, I can't let you go without asking you about being a woman in science, because we know that women and girls are underrepresented in STEM generally, and particularly in science. Although there was a study that was released today that said that it's not because we're lacking confidence. In fact, this study showed that women and girls enter their careers in STEM with great confidence, but somehow end up not rising into the positions of leadership that you have. So to me, you're a great inspiration. Your career is really extraordinary. I wonder if you might give us a little piece of advice, or share something around a challenge you may have overcome that might help a woman who's watching this today and feeling a little stuck in her industry or her career.
Yeah, sure. You're absolutely right. The numbers of graduates from many scientific disciplines, not all, but certainly in the biological sciences and in medicine, is about 50-50, sometimes more women. Different still in the physical sciences, such as engineering or mathematics. But as you go through the career phase, you see this big drop-off at what we call the mid-career phase, usually at the time of women starting families, maybe mid-late 30s. And then you see this big drop-off. I'm not saying that families are the only reason why women don't rise. I do think there is some inherent bias. Many women have stories of discrimination and lack of support. And then you see this plummeting rate, and it hasn't changed over decades. 20% of people in leadership positions in science are women, as opposed to 50% who graduate. So I think for me the most challenging time was certainly when I had young children, and I was in my then early 30s. I've got two boys who are now 24 and 27. And I got through that period because I had a supportive husband, of course, family. I had my mother and my sister nearby. I had friends that were in similar positions, and I used every support network I could. I had no qualms about outsourcing whatever I could as well, housework or anything. And I sort of stuck in that very difficult times, at times feeling a bit guilty, maybe I should be at home more. I've sort of given up on guilt. Don't feel guilty. I think the best advice I could give to young women is just be yourself. Have faith in yourself. Look around for support. Look to your friends, your peers, find mentors. All of that helps. Everyone faces the same struggle, and I think most important, try and be yourself. There's a lot of expectations for women to be someone else, act in a certain way, look a certain way. I just think we should, be yourself.
I love it. Be yourself and don't feel guilty.
Great advice.
I'm taking that away. I'm not feeling guilty about anything. Professor Sharon says don't feel guilty. Now, you guys are having an event tonight at the Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity. You can attend in person or online, and it's COVID-19 vaccines, your questions answered. So many people have many questions. So, Sharon, it's a great event that you're running.
Yeah, just go onto our website, www.doherty.edu.au, and you can register online. Michael Rowlands is hosting it. We have a number of experts, including Margie Danchin, Terry Nolan, Janine Trevelyan and myself, and open to answering any questions people have.
Thanks so much, Professor Sharon Lewin. It's so awesome to speak with you, Sharon. We're really, really blessed to have you.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot.